So this evening, it's my pleasure to introduce Henry Steiner and to talk with all of you about his most recent book, Sleepy Hollow Stories. Now, I am Sara Mascia. I'm the executive director of the Historical Society serving Sleepy Hollow in Tarrytown. And so, basically, I've known Henry most of my life. We grew up as neighbors, and we've spent a lot of time, debating and discussing all kinds of stories about history. We actually grew up in the same neighborhood.
We have the same historical references.
Yes, we absolutely do, both of us being born here. But as I said, this is introduction of Henry's book, and we're going to spend a little time discussing lots of questions that I have for him this evening. So now, do you consider your individual stories in here history? Is this a book about history, or is this a book about the stories about history?
Well, in a way, I mean, I realize what I have to offer. And this is just a few of the stories. A lot of them are more solidly, I'd say, historical pieces. But what I have to offer is sort of an anecdotal point of view. And sometimes that might be the point of view of a child. And I talk about the sensations that one has as, if you live on Crest Drive and you walk out front on a snowy morning, and the things you hear, and even the smell of the air when you're out there, and then the kind of things that a kid who is a member of a gang of boys that goes prowling through the neighborhood and experiences different things, the animals in the area, and just the activities that we would do. There's a piece I wrote about Hackley Field, and by Hackley Field I mean the old Hackley Field, when there was only one field at Hackley, and that was kind of a playground for us because it was easy for us to get to, and we would have it more or less to ourselves, and we could shoot our arrows and down on Hackley Field, or play ball, or watch one of the Hackley students, working out with a javelin or a shot put or something, and it was all, just really interesting.
So in a sense, almost some of this is, and I'm not, a little bit of a love story too, about your love of the community.
Yeah, it really is. And I have a real attachment to this hometown of mine. And when I really think of Tarrytown and Sleepy Hollow as a single community, although they're separate villages and separate townships. But there is that unity in them, and that was only cemented more when they merged the school district together, which a lot of the old timers thought was the worst thing that ever happened. But we share so much. We share this library that we're talking in right now. I mean, this is really the library that people in Tarrytown and Sleepy Hollow lay claim to, and Patriots Park, which is really a shared thing too. There's and then of course you've got separate governments, you've got separate mayors, separate police departments, fire departments, but there is so much that we share. And even it's sort of the kind of sharing that a place that was really one place and then became two places, and then but remained one place and on some level, that maybe not from a municipal standpoint, but
certainly from the way I feel about it, the same way you feel about it. This is our hometown.
Yep.
This is really our hometown.
So I'm sort of in a way, I'm sort of representative of the unity because I grew up in Tarrytown. And then I like to say, and there are people out there who heard this way too often, I like to say that I moved far away one day. I moved to North Tarrytown, and which is now named Sleepy Hollow. So I didn't really move that far, but so I spent a lot of my time here, and there must be a good reason for it. When I was a kid growing up on, eventually we left the Crest, the family moved to Walden Road in Wilson Park, where we had a beautiful river view from my parents' home. You could see the river, it was a wide open view of the river from the dining room and the living room. And when I was a kid, I'd look right through that view. You know, it was like, it wasn't really there. You know, I took it for granted.
Yeah.
And now I feel much more grateful for the things that I've experienced here and the uniqueness of a childhood or even an adulthood in this Hudson River community, because the river lends such a magical dimension to things,
Right.
and both aesthetically and historically. And one of my great interests, Sarah, in history is in the Revolutionary War history.
Mhm.
And
And there's a few stories in that in this.
yeah,
book.
there's a bunch that of stories that date from the time of the Revolution.
Mhm.
But this was essentially one of the great seats of battle for the war, the Hudson Valley, because the British headquarters was in Manhattan, and then there were American lines out around the Croton River, and everything in between. This area that we live in was, I don't know if it was called that at the time, but at a later date, it came to be called the neutral ground. And which is not to say neutral at all, but really a no man's land, a hotly debated
Hotly
territory.
contested territory.
Yeah. Contested, fought over territory
Right.
during the Revolutionary War years.
Mhm.
And so for a guy like me, and I don't know if I caught that bug by growing up here or whether it came later, but that's one of the portions of history that really fascinate me.
Mhm.
And
Well, it looks like a lot fascinates you actually, because it goes from the Native American stories all the way up to almost the present, I mean, 1996 you talk about as well, right?
Right.
With the changing of the name from North Tarrytown
Yeah.
to Sleepy Hollow.
Yeah, there's a piece on the name change from 1996.
Mhm.
And I played a part in that name change. And so that piece is sort of, I'm remembering the people who worked on it with me. And I actually put a very long list of names of people who were personally involved in the drive to change the name.
So, as I was going through a lot of these, there were several of them were written about individuals, and some of them, I don't want to call them characters, but they certainly represent a lot of the history of this community. And several of them were older individuals that you had the ability to chat with before they've passed.
Yeah.
And you have a lot of the information that they were able to pass on to you, which is really important. And one of them was Leonard Abraham. And I enjoyed Leonard, who lived to be over 100. I had many conversations with him as well. And just a little bit of Henry's writing here, just to share how he sort of interjects a little bit of himself and about the person, I found fascinating. And I'm just going to read just a little bit to you. So it was an enriching experience to meet with Leonard Abraham in 2011. Our interview took place less than 2 months before his passing at the age of 100. Leonard died on Sunday, December 18th, 2011. I found him to be warm and intelligent, possessing a great deal of zest for the life he led and also a fondness for his memories of the past. The man I met with was a lovely, modest man with a fantastic memory and physical resources that belied his years. So then you go on to tell his story in this community. And so that it gave me a little bit of chills, because these people were so important.
Right. And really, Leonard was able to put into words the experience of the Jewish community in this community. And, his memory was so good. And he had been at the center of the Jewish community for most of his years. Yeah. Certainly in the building of the new temple, in the late 1950s, but also the old temple down on Valley Street in Sleepy Hollow. He was able to flesh out so much about that old temple that I was really unaware that even existed, because it was eventually torn down because somebody else owned the land the temple was on. It was only a loan. And then, of course, there was the need to expand and to build a new temple, Temple of Abraham, on Leroy Avenue in Tarrytown. So the first temple was in Sleepy Hollow. The second temple the one existing today is in Tarrytown. And Leonard was an occasion, his life was an occasion to talk about the evolution of that community. You know, from the very first merchants who moved to Tarrytown from Manhattan, and Leonard's parents were of that group. You know, they ran a clothing store on Main Street, and Leonard was born in the building that's now the main firehouse on Main Street. The building was there. It was later torn down, and now the firehouse is on that site. Yeah,
corner on Washington and
so
Maine.
I mean, he was, you know, he could remember the first, you know, first and second decades of the 20th century. And if anybody, you know, one of the really fascinating things that came out of that story is the movie theater that was across the street from the place where he was born. He was born in that house.
Oh, that was the Veterans Hall.
And it was the Veterans Hall, which at one time was a silent film theater, and which the nickname of which was The Beautiful. And so they were showing silent films, I don't know, perhaps as early as the musical or perhaps earlier.
No, I think it was about the same, a little bit after maybe.
I mean, the musical is older than that building.
Yeah.
But they may have, I don't know if, you know, when they shifted from vaudeville to silent films, or maybe they were mixing it up, maybe it was both.
A little bit.
So that, yeah, it was such a pleasure to meet Leonard, because I hadn't really met him before I did the article on him. And actually, he was a member of a men's group, down at the Jewish Community Center, the JCC, that had invited me to talk about some aspect of local history. And then unfortunately, he passed away, and I had occasion to talk about Leonard to that group down there. So yeah, you know, each one of these stories, as I think back on, you know, each one is one of my babies. You know?
Absolutely. And one of them that I actually do get a chuckle about is actually somebody who lived 100 years before Leonard Abraham, and that's John Anderson.
Right.
And John Anderson was, you know, a very wealthy man, and he had a mansion that was basically along Broadway in the little community
along New Broadway,
between New Broadway and Broadway, that little sort of triangle of land.
And his estate was essentially, John Anderson's estate was Weber Park.
Weber Park, right?
Right.
So yeah, so he lived there, but everybody thought of him as being a little bit eccentric. There was a lot of strange things that happened in his life, and you know, you bring up a topic that I do laugh about quite a bit, because this was well known in the village at the time, as well as in other circles about poor Mr. Anderson. But it was that in this little paragraph you write, as Anderson embarked on a trip to Europe for his family and close friends had long known that he was troubled by spirits, the supernatural kind, that is. This information was to figure in the subsequent legal battle over the deceased millionaire's estate. It seems that Anderson was in the habit of talking and listening to the spirit of the, yes, still alive, Garibaldi, the spirit of Anderson's deceased son, Willie, as well as the spirit of Mary Rogers. And Mary Rogers was an employee, had died mysteriously 40 years earlier. And yet, here he was still chatting with them, and everybody knew that he was a little bit eccentric.
Right.
When you're rich, you're eccentric.
And the peskiest of those spirits was Mary Rogers.
Of course.
And it seemed, at least that was the story, and that maybe he had a bad conscience about this person named Mary Rogers, who died while in his employ. Right. She died across the river in Jersey City, I believe, or that area. But he
had a cigar store in Manhattan.
Yeah, he was
and
a
she was
tobacconist.
the cigar girl, and she sold cigars at his store.
Right, and his store was located in the sort of the newspaper row of Manhattan. Right. And so many of his customers were newspaper men and writers. And one of those writers was Edgar Allan Poe. So there is a connection. There is between Poe, John Anderson, and Mary Rogers. And the story goes into the details of that. And Mary Rogers, it was the real life model for a character in Edgar Allan Poe's, I believe it was called The Mystery of Marie Roget. He transposed the events that actually took place in New York to Paris for the purpose of this story. And there's some suggestion that Poe wrote the story at the prompting of John Anderson to shift suspicion in the murder or the death of Mary Rogers away from John Anderson. John Anderson was to become a millionaire tobacconist. He was an extremely successful, worked his way up from virtually nothing and became a financial success in New York, investing in some of the earliest railroads. And he at one time owned the land that the Plaza Hotel was subsequently built on. So he was pretty wealthy. And he was also considered material that could eventually become the mayor of New York. But the scandal that grew out of the death of Mary Rogers may have killed his chances for advancement in New York City politics. So he's an interesting figure. And also the story of the association with Edgar Allan Poe and this poor woman this poor young woman who was apparently very attractive. And so one of the ideas apparently was, you have a pretty shop girl behind the counter, all these guys, these writers from the newspapers, what have you, would flock to the store, and that really helped business. Also he had some prestigious military people who would be his clients, and he got to talk that up a little bit with his public. So, but ultimately he started to sort of lose his mind.
But he was very generous to the villages, both
Oh
villages.
yeah, that's a very good point, Sarah. The chapter's monument was modified in 1880, and on the centennial of the capture of Major Andre. So that's when the statue purported to be of John Paulding was added to the monument, the captor's monument. And that statue modification was paid for by John Anderson, which is ironic for the reason that Andre, when he was trying to get by incognito, had a pass from Benedict Arnold when he was stopped by the three captors. And his alias, the alias under which he was traveling, was John Anderson.
I think Anderson got a big kick out of that.
Yeah, I guess maybe that may have been what inspired Anderson to support the monument modification.
Well, he also donated to the churches and
right. Yep, he was a local wealthy guy. Although I do recall in Hutchinson's book.
This is Ted Hutchinson.
Yeah, Ted Theodore Hutchinson.
The history of North Tarrytown.
Yes, right, of the centennial book of North Tarrytown.
History.
He talks about how that Anderson Mansion was always shuttered up, like someone who was a little bit neurotic, living there.
Maybe just a bit.
Yeah. But I think there's also a Washington Irving anecdote about Irving stopping by one day and saying, how about we give this person who could really use the money, give them a little infusion of cash. And, I guess Irving knew that he could hit up Anderson for a donation of that kind.
Oh, I don't doubt that. I don't doubt that at all. So now you have so many of these, like I said, 38 little stories in here. What's your favorite? You have a couple of favorites?
Yeah, that's really hard to say. There are some that operate on me in a personal way, differently from others. And there is something very autobiographical in this book, and that is a book that has the name Herodotus in the title. what's the title of that one? I forget. Oh, Herodotus, the Beginning, it's called.
Yes.
So it's sort of a play on words because Herodotus was the Greek historian, the very early Greek historian, was considered to be the father of Western history. And or the history of Western civilization. So he wrote, his book is called The Histories of Herodotus, and it was one of the things that truly inspired me when I was a young man to rev up my pursuit of history as an interest. And there was something inspirational in Herodotus, and there were many roads that led me to this concentration of personal interest in history, but that was one of them. And I talk about, and when we were kids growing up, the discussion was that, well, American democracy is really based on a democracy that existed in ancient Greece, back in ancient times. And the fight that they had for their independence, to remain independent from Persia, which was the big empire, the boogeyman that wanted to subdue the Greek city states. And these guys, these city states that had made an occupation out of civil wars with one another for so long, actually unaccountably got together to defeat this Persian threat. And it's Herodotus who gives us the details of that war, of those battles.
So now, do you see yourself as the Sleepy Hollow Herodotus?
Well, as basically as the seeds and the precedent to our own, our own democracy and our own history. As wherever we sit vis-a-vis Western history, that Herodotus is that connection. And again, and so it's exciting to read the story that he lays out for us. And like my own book, I'm not saying that my book is anything as good or as durable as Herodotus, but he writes these relatively small stories and kind of sews them together. And in fact, when he can be in the middle of a story and he'll start some other story in the middle of it, and just go off on a tangent for a while and come back to the main story.
Kind of like you. No, just kidding.
Except that he doesn't figure in those other stories that much.
So now, reading these and looking at all these short stories, I did have a question. I mean, when you look at them, you talk about these and you have such a feeling for all these locations where these stories do you have a favorite sort of historic site? Obviously, I'm interested in history too.
Yeah.
So what is your favorite historic sites?
Sarah, in the book, there are 3 very short pieces, and there are 3 what I call favorite places that, places that I go to if I want to just sort of some peace and quiet, or I want to read a book or just reflect, because they're really kind of unique, and they're just kind of quirky choices that I made as favorite places. So there's a story here about that portion of the Pecanico River that's near the old dam. If you've ever been walking along the Pecanico in the cemetery, eventually you'll come to this old factory dam that for people who grew up in Weber
Lister's
Park,
factory,
yeah, it was the original factory was called Lister's Bone and Button Factory.
Yep.
So they would take animal bones, grind them up, make fertilizer out of them, or they would make buttons out of the bones. And then subsequently, that same site became the Pecanico Tool and Die Works in the later 19th century. But that place, and first of all, it's right in the valley of the Pecanico, and the river comes through there, and it's very low because the road that you take to get there is much higher up. So when you're down in that part of the valley, you're not really looking out at things other than trees and the river.
It's very peaceful.
You're really sequestered there. It's very peaceful, and you've got that constant music of the river going by. You know, sometimes it's just a trickle, it's just a little, you know, light percussion, and sometimes it's roaring by. You know, during the spring freshets, there's a lot of music. It's like a symphony as it goes by. And then another one of the places in Tarrytown that I like to go off to and take my camp chair is what I call the cut. And it's a railroad cut that goes through the ridge that runs along the east side of the Tarrytown Lakes. And at one
That's where the old
time,
Putnam line
it
was,
used to be part of the old Putnam Railroad line,
right?
which at one time was directed around the Tarrytown Lakes. There was like a horseshoe curve that went around the Tarrytown Lakes, or where the Tarrytown Lakes were going to be, and then ran up into Mechanical Hills. But at the time that this cut was made, they didn't want to have to make that horseshoe curve. It was going to take them too far out of the way. So the idea was to build a trestle across the valley between that ridge and the ridge of Mechanical Hills, to go straight up there on this trestle. But the trestle only lasted for a couple of years. They got the idea that maybe either it wasn't safe, or that passengers on the train simply wouldn't take the train because it looked too deadly, you know.
It was like 100 feet up in the air, and this little wooden,
it looked pretty dangerous.
Rickety wooden bridge. You know,
So,
I wouldn't go over it either.
So this cut was abandoned. Essentially, they blasted through this rock ridge, but left this railroad cut where they created it. So you can take your chair and go sit up there and read a book, or look at the place where the trestle actually took off towards Mechanical Hills. You know, it's funny because there's no trestle there anymore, but you can see,
almost imagine it.
You can almost trace it through the air as it went up to Mechanical Hills. So that's number two. And then the third one I selected was down in Irvington, and that is called Halsey Pond.
Okay.
And for a Tarrytown boy or a Sleepy Hollow boy, you know, you may not have occasion to go to Halsey Pond that often, but you know, if eventually you stumble on it, you realize it's truly a special place. There's a wonderful pond there. There's this old tea house. It's like it looks like a you know, a castle tower that overlooks the pond, and there are trails around. It's not very big, but if you're there on a slightly drizzly day and you've got your umbrella and your raincoat on, you might be the only person there, and it's like a meditation just to walk around the place. You know, some wise person once said, you know, the whole world looks different after one walk around the lake. And so if something's bothering you, try Halsey Pond. You know, by the time you finish that one tour of the lake, you may have forgotten what it was that was bothering you.
So, but one of your specialties, as I've noticed, is you really do like to talk about people and things that they do. I mean, you talk about Rockwell Kent, Mackenzie, you know, Leonard Abraham, as I mentioned already, Pete the Miller, who used to work at you know, Phillipsburg Manor, and you know, Alice Cochran, who was another native daughter, you know, and John Paulding, who was, you know, and then, you know, of course, another one of my favorites,
Chickalella, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, you really do, you know, tell people some of his story, because he's another person that you've actually sat down with, and Chick, as many of you may know, is going to be turning 100 in January 1st, 2021. So, and he has been giving to the community as well as his country his whole life. So reading his story was also, you know, another inspiring thing for me. Yes. Right now he's working on his memorial statue that's going to be going down to the Gold Star Mothers at Haran's Landing. It's another project.
Yeah,
of his,
I mean, a lot of what Chick does is so selfless. You know, it's really it's for the church, it's for the veterans, it's for the mothers the Gold Star mothers.
And
You know, I wrote an article about the mother of a classmate of mine at Sleepy Hollow High School. He was killed in Vietnam.
I remember that article.
And his mother was devastated by her son's death. It ran so deep in her. And I had an opportunity to talk to her about her feelings on that. And it was right about that time. I think that, there was a preliminary story that went out on that subject. And I think it was around that time that she was invited as a Gold Star mother to come down to the Memorial Day services at Patriots Park and be the main participant there.
It's awful hard to do.
Yeah. And but her own story is so fascinating. You know, a girl who grew up in West Virginia, whose roots were Hungarian, and she worked for a while at Suncliffe. I don't know how many people know what Suncliffe was.
Wasn't that like a?
It was an estate.
Yeah, it was up off of McKeel, right?
Right, it's off of McKeel and Beach Lane.
Right.
And Mrs. Gould, not the Goulds that we
Charles
think. Mrs. Charles Gould, not the J. Gould family, but Mrs. Charles Gould, who was a wealthy woman and actually built her own mansion, paid for her own mansion there. She, eventually, I guess, that estate went into the hands of somebody who ran it as a resort, or
it's kind of like
a getaway,
a getaway, sort of like a
or
retreat.
spa or something. I don't know.
Whatever that was.
Because I remember moving into that neighborhood and then going prowling back there, and seeing the old swimming pool that had this tile motif and what have you back there. And then seeing that there were people there, and I got the heck out of there because I wasn't supposed to be there. But
well, she actually had a whole theater, Mrs. Gould.
Right, she had an amphitheater for performances, and that leads to the story about the IWW and their demonstration of the Rockefellers and the Rockefeller enterprises. And a riot that took place in Tarrytown back in what year was it? 1914, something like that.
Yeah.
And Mrs. Gould had the temerity to suggest to the IWW, the Wobblies, that if they had a lot of trouble, the group had a lot of trouble finding a hall that would accept them because nobody wanted to fall into the bad graces of the Rockefeller family. But Mrs. Gould apparently was not intimidated and offered her grounds to the demonstrators. But ultimately a riot broke out, and I guess they never really used it, or didn't use it a second time.
Well, they had Upton Sinclair come, right?
Right, yeah. And who was the Emma Golding?
Yeah.
Emma Goldman.
Oh, yeah.
So they were all up here. They took the train up from Manhattan and tried demonstrating in Tarrytown. But you'd think that the working man and woman of Tarrytown might actually side with them, but no, they sided with the Rockefellers because that's where the bread was buttered. And a lot of people were working on the estate as landscapers.
I think also people sort of felt protective because they were neighbors and you didn't want anybody to,
Well, that too. Yeah. And also, I mean, they had, I think they had donated, made improvements and what have you. But mainly, I think they had employed a very large number of local people on their estate, and that was considered to be a very valuable thing.
So now when you find a story that you get your teeth in and you don't want to let it go, what is your favorite part about a story? Is it the actual interview with the individuals, if there is an individual? Is it sitting down and doing the research to make sure that you're not just telling a story, you're telling something that's real? Or is it really sharing it and sitting down and writing the story, or like we are tonight, talking about the story? What is your favorite part of this whole sort of?
Well, I think my favorite part is really the creation of the story, and that includes the research and the actual writing. But Yeah, I enjoy talking with, there was a time frame when I was doing a lot of interviews with old timers,
Mhm.
many of whom have passed away. I've written, some of the stories that you find are like Alice Cochran is a
Yeah.
person who passed
Mhm.
a number of years ago. Um, to me, it was very important to me to get her story down.
Mhm.
I recorded it, and the story is based on that recording I had with her. And she was such a unique personality. She had so much drive,
Mhm.
and she was in a way typical of the old time North Tarrytown,
Mhm.
where if you got in trouble downtown, any adult could give you a whack, and then when you got home, you'd get another one.
Because they heard about the whack
That
that
was
got downtown.
right. So it wasn't like, oh, they were going to say, oh, they did what to you?
What were you
They must
doing?
have had a good
I was
reason.
going to say, what were you doing that gave them the reason to do that? That's true.
So Alice, who spent a lot of her adult years in Tarrytown, grew up in North Tarrytown, Sleepy Hollow, and was a member of the Black community of this community. And unlike a lot of the other Black families of Tarrytown, Sleepy Hollow, her family was Catholic, which
Mhm.
was really unique because she came from
The island.
an island,
Yeah.
a French-speaking island
Mhm.
in the Caribbean where everybody was Catholic, I guess,
Right. Yeah.
So that's how those things work out. But and she had a wonderful big family, many of the members of which I know personally
Mhm.
and are wonderful people. And how could you not be wonderful after Alice was your mother? So, and she was a community leader, but it wasn't, she really took the reins of certain issues, like, social justice
Mhm.
and
Oh,
civil
yes.
rights and, economic reforms,
Mhm.
for, so, she was a dynamo.
Mhm.
And she knew a lot of the other people in town who were influential, and she remembered everything. She remembered all of it. And so just talking to
Unlike
her was
me, who has to write everything down, just in case.
yeah. She even remembered there was there was a bass player who went to North Tarrytown High School, and there was a famous Black musician, jazz musician named Moten, Bernie Moten, I think is his name,
Mhm.
a keyboard artist. But this guy had the exact same name, but he was a bass player and he became a professional jazz player. But because he lived in the shadow of the other Moten, he wasn't as recognizable, although he was he would have made an interesting story, just how he came out of North Tarrytown and had a career in jazz, a
Right.
national career in jazz.
Mm.
Um, so, and also she remembered, one of the things that she remembered was there was a park where the H Bridge is, under the H Bridge.
Mm. I didn't know that.
And they would have concerts in that park.
Wow.
They would roller skate, the kids would roller skate in the park under the H Bridge. And at one of these parks, they had Cab Calloway, and
Oh, that would have been great.
the music was Cab Calloway and Charlie Christian.
Uh-huh.
So, jazz greats.
Yeah. And who would know that now?
Yeah.
It's sort of that's why this is so fascinating to me, because a lot of these stories are so nostalgic that, and a lot of them I remember too, some of the stories that you're telling. So
Right.
it's great to share that. I mean, we were lucky we grew up here, but even for people who didn't live here, reading this nostalgic stories and reading the other stories gives you such an introduction to the community and to our history that
Right.
it's absolutely fascinating. So
one of the other things I was trying to do, Sarah,
right.
is from a strictly historical standpoint or point of view, I love history. I love local history. I love revolutionary history. But one of the things I do, and I've been doing this history thing for a long time, and one of the things I like to concentrate on is things that I view as the problems in local history. So a problem in local history it would be where the facts come into conflict with, other information that may not be factual. It may be, it may be traditional.
Are you referring to anybody in particular?
No, I'm referring to a lot of people, but for instance, in the very first story in this book is called Andre's Tree. And it's a vanished landmark. Andre's Tree was a historical thing that does not exist anymore. We know where it stood. It actually stood in front of this library in the middle of the Albany Post Road.
Right.
Isn't that right? That and but there are all kinds of erroneous traditions involving Andre's Tree. Like it was at the capture site of Major Andre, which it wasn't.
There was a tulip tree there.
Well, no, the tulip tree is Andre's Tree.
Well, there was another tulip tree.
Well, there are tulip trees all over the place.
That's the problem.
But Andre's Tree it stood like a monument in the Albany Post Road. So, and it's named for Major Andre, who may never have actually seen it because he got stopped at the river at Andre's Brook, which he may not have been looking at trees at that point. He was probably looking at guys with muskets. But so Andre's Tree, one of the apocryphal stories about Andre's Tree is that Andre was actually hanged at Andre's Tree because it was a convenient tree. But that's not an apple tree across the river. But that was not actually where Andre met his demise. That was across the river. The other, another one of the stories about Andre's Tree is that the tree itself stood right next to Andre's Brook, and that was not the case. But there is a published contemporary account of Andre's Tree that we can use for that kind of information. And so we talk a little bit about Andre's Tree. And
did you know we have a little piece of Andre's Tree at the Historical Society? So if you really feel nostalgic, you can come touch the piece.
I don't think I ever really focused on that.
Yeah.
I wonder. So is it a piece of tulip tree?
Yeah.
It is. One of the interesting things is that if you just walk into Patriots Park, there are lots of tulip trees in Patriots Park. There are clumps of them, little clusters of them.
They're the great grandchildren.
They may be descendants of the original Andre's Tree, but that was a fun one to write, and that's in the book starts off with that. And then again, there's a kind of story that is more of an essay. There are a few essays, and one such essay is entitled "The Headless Horseman's Headlessness." And it's just an essay on what does it mean to have a spirit without a head, and what does it signify, and what is it supposed to conjure up, this headless spirit. And so I had a little fun with that, and I went around and interviewed a psychiatrist, a couple of people who were in a position to have professional opinions on that score. And so I think it's a fun thing to read about the Headless Horseman's headlessness. It certainly makes, if a spirit is already scary, maybe a headless spirit is that much more scary.
So now, when you wrote this, you wrote all these stories, you put them all together. Did you feel kind of like, people in the past, the way they did things? I mean, here we are celebrating the 200th anniversary of the sketchbook by Jeffrey Cram, which is Washington Irving's, book 1 and book 2, all full of short stories, very similar, short stories that he put together, or maybe Edgar Mayhew Bacon's Chronicles of Tarrytown and Sleepy Hollow, which are a series of short stories and topics.
That's true. Yeah, he kind of breaks it up too.
Did you feel like you were sort of following in their footsteps?
I certainly find, I like Bacon very much. I'm not sure that he inspired my format, but the sketchbook is very much on my mind when I'm writing, and Washington Irving is on my mind.
Of course, he's in the book a couple of times
yeah.
too.
Yeah, and so there are a number of stories that relate to Washington Irving. One is called The Last Days of Washington Irving, and it talks about the kind of uncharacteristic things that Irving was experiencing in his last year. He was ill, and he was not his old self. He was, he was such a courtly, really intelligent, an intellectual, but noted just for his personality. People loved his personality. He was the rock star of American society in the mid to early 19th century, and he had this incredible reputation as a writer and as a person that James Fenimore Cooper would have died for. He was so jealous of Irving and of the popularity of Irving.
I think Poe was as well.
Yeah, I mean, actually one of the things that Irving did that Poe and Cooper did not do is Irving stayed out of controversy. He was a pretty non-controversial figure, whereas it seemed that Poe was sort of fed on controversy, and so did Cooper. So anyway, that's a little sideline there. But there's another piece in actually the very last piece in the book has to do with the holidays, and it has to do specifically with Christmas and the spirit of Christmas. And we've got, I refer to Irving and to a young British author who was inspired by Irving by the name of Charles Dickens. And Dickens had a lot to write about Christmas and the spirit of Christmas, of course. And what I say in the article is it looks like he was significantly inspired by Irving.
Oh, I think so. I think you're absolutely on target.
In different ways. I mean, that for Irving, the spiritual side of Christmas was not a religious thing. It was spiritual, but it was more of a secular outlook.
It was family too.
Right, and just and about people and the effect of the spirit of Christmas, that what it has, it's transformative to people and their outlook and the impression that they make on other people. And so there's a lot of differences in the approach that Dickens takes in A Christmas Carol, and in the stories that Irving tells in the sketchbook about Christmas and the spirit of Christmas. But I think they're both interesting. Obviously, the better known of the two is Dickens and A Christmas Carol.
So now this is self-published. You self-published this book, but it is available in town, is it not?
It is. Actually, this is published by Milestone Productions, and which is a company that I control and own. But it is available at Bella's Boutique in Tarrytown. It's also available at Pretty Funny Vintage, also on Route 9 in Tarrytown. So if somebody would like to go to the store and buy one, they can be had there. But also, if you're not in town or it's more convenient to order, say from Amazon, you can do that as well. You can order from Amazon.
Or you can take it out from the library.
Or you can borrow it from the Warner Library.
Yeah.
Because there are at least a couple of copies here at the Warner Library if you'd just like to take a look at it, maybe read a story or two and see what it's like.
Well, I tell you, that's one of the things that I did. I spent a lot of time, read, like you said, skipped around a little bit, didn't read straight through. I kind of went to the stories I wanted to read.
Right.
And then I kind of headed back. And so it's
That's actually, the way I read it too.
It's actually a great nighttime read because, I tend to fall asleep in the
Right.
middle of a book. But it's these short little stories. It just gives
Right.
you such a great little
And
insight.
there's also plenty of graphic material.
Yes,
in
there
it.
is.
So
Lots of maps, lots of
I'm a
photographs.
big believer in show and tell.
Mhm.
So I think most readers will enjoy the fact that there's a lot of graphic information here as well.
Mhm. So there's a couple of questions for some readers that I'm going to read to you. One of them is, did you change or update any stories because you learned more?
I did, yes. A lot of these stories were in flux, but in some cases it was just a minimal change, and others I may have substantially added to the story. But offhand, I would have to go through the list, and even then, I'm not sure I would recall exactly which ones I expanded. But yes, a lot of them, because some of them were written some time ago, and I've come across in the course of time, I've come across additional information that I find really interesting, or I feel that will help, flesh it out to make it a little bit more vivid.
So there's another question that came in. Are there themes that you see to the stories in the book? Themes that tie the stories together in the book.
I'd say pretty much not. I'd say for the most part, the stories stand on their own. And it is nonfiction. Even my little biographical deviations are nonfiction. It's just my impression of things, but things were recollected from the past. But I would say no, that thematically it's certainly the topics are pretty diverse.
Mm-hmm.
And but as I do a book like this, and my next book will be sort of along these lines as well. It's going to be an assembly of short pieces.
That's what my next question was.
Yeah.
What's next on the horizon?
Yeah, I'm actually working on the next book right now. But I have a lot more to write about. I really feel that personally, there's so much more that I really want to write about.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I really like about writing is that when I'm in the process of writing, I'm really learning. I'm really learning about the subject that I'm writing about. And to me, that's a very good thing. It's a really good feeling to learn more about, and obviously I wouldn't be writing about these topics unless they interested me personally.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of the driving impetus to pick up a new subject for me, is something that I just find personally interesting. I guess I have to apologize if I'm not covering something that somebody would want me to cover, but there's so much more that I do want to write about. And I think that I would like to leave a record of things that relate to local history that I think other people would find valuable, and maybe people in the future would find valuable.
So I got, on continuing on that first question that I asked you, that somebody had written, and did you see like 180-degree turn in any of your stories? Like when you first were started to write about that and you realized, that's not what I want to write about. I want to write about something different. Did you change something dramatically?
You mean leave off the topic?
I guess maybe the way the theme was writing, or just all of a sudden say, you know what, I'm not going to talk about this person in this way. I'm going to talk about this thing that happened to them instead.
I started out to write a piece about a guy named John B. Jervis, who was a very important engineer of New York State and elsewhere, but particularly identified with New York State. He grew up in Rome, New York, and worked as a grunt on the Erie Canal. And then before the Erie Canal was completed, he was already working as an engineer on that project. He came up through the ranks, seat of his pants, and became one of the greatest engineers in New York history. Designed the Hudson River Railroad, designed the old Croton Aqueduct. And so he's really left his mark on Sleepy Hollow and Tarrytown.
The whole Hudson Valley.
And the whole Hudson Valley, the whole state of New York. And he was a guy that, you know, I could write any number of things about. But what really fascinated me was that little seed of a kid, of a guy who discovered that he wanted to be an engineer. And so that's what my story concentrates on. It concentrates on how this just local kid from upstate New York had an opportunity one day to work, to just be a worker on the Erie Canal. And that just changed the whole trajectory of his life. And our lives too, because so much of what he did made an impact on us.
So your next question is, what's your favorite story about Tarrytown and Sleepy Hollow that most people believe is real, but is really just fiction, lore, folklore?
Oh my goodness.
Do you have one? Because I know you kind of mentioned a few of them in here.
Yeah, but I can't remember.
Okay, now you got to think about that one. Or is there one person in our history that you could interview to get the real story? Who would that be from Tarrytown or Sleepy? Who would be the one person that you would think that you want to talk to in history?
Oh my goodness.
Out of all the stuff that's happened here, who's the person you feel
Well,
like I missed out?
I don't know if the one person would be Washington Irving, but he would definitely be one of the people I want to talk. I want to talk to that man. And another person I'd really like to talk to is John Paulding. I would like to talk to him. And going back to the last question, you know, and there was a good deal of controversy about the captors, you know, who Washington recognized to have been operating from the truest, highest motivations in their capture of Major Andre. But later they were disparaged, that they were accused of being no more than highwaymen. And
that sort of got mixed up all in history.
Right.
That story.
And so to the point where, you know, I'll have a conversation with somebody who knows next to nothing about any of that incident or of that time frame, but they know that they were robbers. You know, in other words, I really believe, and of course I have to do this because, you know, you have to swear to believe in everything that the captors did when you were a kid.
And you better, because there's only this little piece of plastic between us right now.
You might get blown up. But I truly believe that John Paulding in particular was motivated by the most sincere motivations.
I think Isaac Van Wert was as well.
And
you know,
I think all of them were.
I don't have a handle on David
But
Williams.
I really think that this was a gambit. This story that was told about them after the fact was the gambit of an elitist class to disparage
the poor working farmer.
The honest motivations of these three men because of the individual who, because they had a desire to elevate Andre. And Andre was a spy. He was caught incognito. He was incognito with plans to our main fortress at West Point.
Boom. And, that's it.
Yeah, done.
Enough said.
That's right. There's your verdict. But in the book, there is a story about John Paulding, and it's based on a talk I gave on one of the anniversaries of the capture of Major Andre. I gave this talk near the grave of John Paulding in Cortlandt Manor, New York, and I really liked the remark that I made on that, because I think I had an opportunity to go right to the heart of the matter. And this confrontation by two kidders, John Andre and John Paulding, they were both kidders. And you know what they say, never try to kid a kidder. And that's what Andre tried to do with Paulding.
That's true. That's true. So.
I just want to say one thing, Sarah, before
Well,
I
we're
know-
not
I
going
know
anywhere. I
we're
have one
about to
more
wrap
question
up,
to you.
but I want to thank Sara Mascia, the executive director of the Historical Society, serving Sleepy Hollow in Tarrytown. I'd also like to thank everybody at the society for their support over the years. In the acknowledgements of the book, I go into some detail about that, and I sincerely mean that. And I also want to thank Maureen Petrie, the director of the library, the Warner Library, for arranging for this. I was supposed to give a live talk here back in the spring, and due to the COVID situation, that had to be postponed. But she was good enough to follow up and ask me to do this tonight, and I really enjoyed doing this. Really enjoyed talking with Sara.
You know, and
anytime.
we spent hours preparing for this
Yeah.
just because we start talking about history and it just doesn't
Yeah,
end.
we go on a lot of tangents, down a lot of lanes, but it's always enjoyable.
Yeah.
And so that was really a lot of fun for me to do this tonight, and I really appreciate it.
Well, and we want to thank you, Henry, because honestly, these stories are now part of our, you know, our lexicon, whatever you want to say, because they're right here. They're in book form. You know, they're not going to be lost. You know, I know some of these people, but now I have it, you know, they're now, you know, kept in perpetuity here.
Thank you,
because of
Sara.
this, because it
And that's
really
one of
is.
the things I enjoy about it, is because it actually, it now allows me to put a period at the end of my research. You know, you know, there might be research that goes, I might go on and do one of these,
Oh,
you know,
yes.
expand it out at some other point if
Mhm.
if the circumstances dictate that. But it's nice to put this, you know, to package it in this form and know that it's there, you know.
Well, so thank you, everyone. Unless you have any more questions, I think we're going to say goodnight now. And we do appreciate you visiting with us this evening. And please go get a copy of this book. And one of Henry's other books, one of his first books that he wrote was The Place Names of Tarrytown and Sleepy Hollow, which it's my Bible. You know, very well researched and done as well. So that one.
And the book that predates this one is the annotated Legend of Sleepy Hollow, the historically annotated Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And it's still the 200th anniversary of the publication of the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, as long as this year lasts.
That's true.
Which is at least another month, you know, month and a half or so.
So, well, thank you all, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.